I don't think it's ethical to take money from one person and give it to another person for no good reason. But taking money and giving it to someone else for no other reason than you believe that other person should have it more than the person from whom you took it. And in the face of economic experience that suggests that it doesn't have any other effect, you do not lift people out of poverty, I think that that is as bad an idea as political ideas get. But one of the underappreciated aspects of District 20 is the tremendous diversity even within socioeconomic strata. The need not only for reform of how we approach poverty, but the real immediate hunger for criminal justice reform mean that what I would argue are the top two issues in the race are things that I've cared about a great deal for a long, long time, both personally and professionally, both as an economist and as a police officer. And I think we're all still frustrated that there's Americans there who wish they could get out, and we're frustrated that we seem to have lost focus on that. I still believe it's an important issue. So we can argue about that, but I do think he has been trying to do the right thing for some time in terms of getting us out of Afghanistan. That's something I've been frustrated about for years and years and years. I just think that that was a mission that should not have been dragged out for as long as it was. I would actually argue that going back 18 years, we probably should have been out of there. Not only has he contributed to splitting the country, no, he hasn't quite characterized people who are not vaccinated as bad people, but he's gotten so close to that there has been such resentment that I do believe that a certain proportion of our population is not vaccinated just because of that. Is this idea of pushing trillions of dollars of spending. It's been ill-timed, ill-advised, the wrong amount, and badly handled, not just in terms of the politics. Someone else can criticize him for how he's managed the politics of it. But from an economic perspective, it's just a bad approach. The packages have contributed to inflation. I don't think there's really much argument about that. The free payments were not all of which were his fault, right? But the COVID-related payments really undermined our labor markets in a way that has contributed to lower labor force participation, contributed to inflation. We're all glad that wages have come up at the bottom end, but this is not the way that we had intended for that to happen. Undermine economic growth. It's really been a problem. And so we all wish that that hadn't happened. But then doubling down on this idea of extra spending, to be honest, I've been surprised that it appears as though the politics have just become runaway. The Democratic Party really seems perfectly comfortable disregarding the extent to which we have a debt crisis in this country, and perfectly comfortable disregarding the fact that inflation is really significant. I wouldn't quite characterize it as a monetary crisis at this point, but this is what the beginning of a monetary crisis looks like. I believe that we need to dedicate serious resources to the border in order to dramatically increase the rate at which we are able to bring in immigrants safely and responsibly. And so if, as a nation, we feel that it is important to vet people as they come in, then let's dedicate the resources necessary to do that, because certainly at the moment, that vetting has become our excuse not to let more people in because we don't have the resources, right? Indeed, our big crisis at the border is because we can't process people fast enough. But if you're making policy about the nature of your population 10, 20, 100 years from now, based on your inability to dedicate resources to vetting people at the border, I think something has gone seriously wrong. I think immigration is America. And I think if we're not comfortable with that concept, we need to think long and hard about what we believe America actually is. There is no good reason to believe that any particular number represents a better population for the United States than any other number. So if we have 300 and, I don't know, what's the latest number? Let's say it's 350 million people in the United States. There's no reason to believe that that's any more optimal than 450, 550, 650, or 750. It is not true that we don't have the land mass. It is not true that our economy would not grow in proportion to our population. It is not true that immigrants are a drain on our government or our resources. It is not true that immigrants bring in crime, even at the rate of people born in the United States. On a net basis, the crime rate would go down if we had greater immigration. Just as I don't think it's ethical to take money from one person and give it to another person for no good reason. Okay. The reason it doesn't work is because it creates an ability for people to work less. In other words, what the experience has been is that when you give money in similar circumstances, if you give money to families without a work requirement, no strings attached, right? You lower their earnings. They earn less, they work less. Not only is it a bad idea generally, but it's a bad idea specifically for where we are in our economy today, right? In 2021, we're trying to get people to work more, not less. And indeed, the COVID payments, it's a little bit more complicated because we had COVID itself, but the COVID payments illustrate what happens when you give people money. People, it facilitates them not going to work. If we are to have a North Star at all, it's got to be our Constitution until and unless we agree to amend it, and there are processes for doing that. And taking money from someone and giving it to someone else for no other reason than a majority vote is just not something that we should be engaged in politically. But taking money and giving it to someone else for no other reason than you believe that other person should have it more than the person from whom you took it. And in the face of economic experience that suggests that it doesn't have any other effect, you do not lift people out of poverty, I think that is as bad an idea as political ideas get. Blowing trillions of dollars on the defense budget. Horrible idea, right? Or on the Republican side, we seem to believe, as the Republican political party, we seem to believe that it's important for us to project military power around the world. I don't agree with that, nor do I agree that we need an ability to fight 2 wars with the entirety of the rest of the world simultaneously and win, which is basically our capability today. I am a big proponent of criminal justice reform, police reform in particular. As a police officer, I know that we have to make some changes. I know how to make those changes. I know which changes are important. I believe that I can sell it to police officers. I haven't uniformly been successful in convincing all of my friends of the nature of reforms that I believe that we need, but I've been largely successful. I found that police officers are more open to reform than the Republican Party has given them credit for, I'll tell you that much. I do believe that Democrats who fail to shout down this idea of defunding police are making a mistake. And I believe that that's true in a more important way than just a political mistake. Yeah, it's a huge political mistake because most people don't want their police department to be defunded. They want their police department to be better, to be reformed in some sense. They want it to perform better. But I also think there are more important issues than just the politics. I just don't like the idea that the Democratic Party, and not just Democrats, people who are not a member of a party, but any number of people that the Democratic Party has sided with, shall we say, just knee-jerk reaction to some of the things that we see in our communities that disappoint us about the interactions between our communities and our police. Just knee-jerk reactions say, well, we want less of police, as though that were a thoughtful response. But I believe that we can make differences in crime rates without a heavy hand. I believe that a sophisticated approach to policing, a more modern approach to policing, can rebuild the trust that we've lost between police departments and our communities. Most Americans, by any demographic category, you look at the polling data, want either the same amount of police presence or more. They just want reforms in place to create incentives for police officers to do a better job. And from my perspective, that means making police work more like other industries. Make it easier to fire bad ones, hire good ones, pay good ones more, bad ones less, replace qualified immunity with liability insurance like in other businesses, so that an insurance company will run out bad officers, even if unions seek to protect bad officers, because liability insurance providers are not going to be held back by union contracts. That racism in police work, just like racism in the rest of the United States, has been on the decline. No, it's absolutely not down to zero, of course, as much as we wish that it were. I think the big untold story is that the heavy-handed nature of police work in the United States is bigger than the racism story. In other words, I believe that the incentive structure in place allows what I continue to call a heavy-handed criminal justice system, irrespective of race. Now, the big problem is that it weighs most heavily on people in poverty for a number of reasons that we can go into. And for historical reasons, poverty and minority status, particularly Black, are highly intertwined, right? So the fact that police work has problems that need to be reformed, that fact, accepting that fact, that weighs most heavily in the Black community. So yes, we need to make reforms that will affect the Black community most. I do not believe the most important of those reforms are further elimination of racism. That's not to say that we don't need to continue to work at eliminating racism. We need to work at that, and we need to work at, many other issues. But the biggest, the most important, are that we need to create an incentive for officers to do the right thing or face discipline in a much more transparent fashion that holds officers accountable, whether their transgressions are against someone who's Black or Hispanic or white or any which way. Hey, one of the big things that I talk about in the campaign, but have been interested in for a long time, is the war on poverty, which I think is actually the leading example for a number of reasons, in a number of ways, of a well-intentioned set of government programs that hasn't, let's all agree, it hasn't gone perfectly, right? I would argue that it hasn't gone well, but at the very least, we have to acknowledge that it has had its disappointments. Trillions of dollars spent. There is still a significant proportion of our economy which would be represented by people who I would characterize as trapped in what I call intergenerational poverty, right? This is a phenomenon that is wholly different from the way that the rest of the economy behaves. There's lots of mobility in the rest of the economy, but not at the lower rung of the ladder. And I would argue that this is in no small part due to some of the mistakes that we have made in terms of public policy. Again, I hasten to add the best of intentions notwithstanding. In other words, if you go back to, let's go back to the 80s, when Ronald Reagan said that a rising tide would lift all ships, right? Would lift all boats. We believed that, and I think we all wanted to believe that, right? I mean, no one didn't want to believe that a growing economy wouldn't help absolutely everybody. And to a large extent it did. Wages came up a little bit, even at the bottom end. We had good expansion, a lot of people got wealthy. But what we found is that any number of people, families, from one generation to another remain trapped in poverty. And I believe that this is attributable to a relatively small number of phenomena. The number one of which is just bad public schools and lack of access to competitive private schools. One of the big differences that we see between families that do well and families that don't do well is access to good education early on, right? Primary school. And I don't think anyone would argue that we don't have the best of intentions in building a terrific public school system. Certainly we throw a tremendous amount of money at it by any standard, really, by the standards of private schools, by the standards of other nations, by the standards of how much money we spend on anything else related to young people. And we don't get a very good bang for the buck in poor communities. High dropout rates, low rates of, passing standardized tests and things like this. Not to mention ridiculously high crime rates associated with any number of schools, especially in urban areas. And we see this, by the way, cut across black, white, Hispanic. The one thing that's common is the relationship between poverty and bad schools. So I would not characterize that as per se a racial problem, right? It's highly correlated with racial minority status, but this is the nexus of what a lot of libertarians see as government efforts that don't go well.